The United States is under siege. Troops pour in through Alaska, relentless and unyielding. The Pacific and Atlantic Oceans have become battlegrounds, with warships clashing in brutal naval combat. A land invasion surges up from South America. The enemy is not just one nation, it's all 5 of the original BRICS powers: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The US is at war with all 5 of the original BRICS nations. But in this ultimate showdown, who will emerge victorious? We uncover the answer in today's episode of the Infographic Show: USA versus BRICS. Who would win? But first, why are these nations fighting in the first place? BRICS exists to mount a challenge against the existing Western-led world order. The US spearheads that world order, which the BRICS nations believe is unfair and exploitative. But that alone wasn't enough to trigger a war. All 5 of the BRICS nations benefit from America being the world's power player. For instance, trade between the US and China reached an estimated $582.4 billion in 2024. Trade with India, though not as lucrative, was still strong. $129.2 billion exchanged hands between the two nations. So trade isn't at the heart of the war. Russia and China are the aggressors. Stung by US sanctions and determined to break free from American dominance, they rally the rest of the BRICS nations to take a stand. If the US can cripple Russia and China's economies, what's to stop it from doing the same to Brazil, India, or South Africa? Fearing they could be next, BRICS unites under a single goal: to bring down the United States and establish a new BRICS-led world order. But before it can do that, it has to defeat the US. It's a fight for America's survival that starts with the manpower that all 6 nations bring to the table. In mounting its defense, the US has an impressive number of active and reserve troops available to call on. The country's military has 1.3 million active personnel, according to military aggregator Global Firepower. It also has almost 800,000 reserves to help defend the nation. And it doesn't end there. The US has one of the most well-armed citizenships in the entire world. It's estimated that there are around 398 million firearms in possession in a country that contains around 260 million adults. That amounts to more than 1.5 guns per American adult. Granted, only 41% of Americans say they'd be willing to fight for their country if they got wrapped up in a war, but that's still a potential civilian army of 106.6 million. However, that civilian army would be untrained and would likely cause more problems than they could solve if the BRICS nations invaded. There's another challenge for the US to confront on the manpower front. Not all of its soldiers are stationed in the US. America maintains around 750 military bases in more than 80 countries, which gives it a massive global reach. That reach will help America in the naval battle against BRICS, as we'll explore later, but it also means America has fewer soldiers stationed on domestic soil than it might like. As of September 2023, the US had around 228,000 military personnel stationed overseas, 168,000 of whom were active duty soldiers. The rest were reserves and civilian personnel working with the Department of Defense. Will they be missed in the defense of the US from BRICS? Possibly. On a pure manpower front, the combined BRICS nations easily beat the US. China alone brings 2 million active military personnel, along with over 510,000 reserves to the fight. Russia adds an army of 1.3 million with 2 million reserves, with India bringing 1.4 million active fighters and over 1 million reserve personnel. Those 3 nations make up the rest of the top spots in Global Firepower's rankings behind the United States, and they are a combined force to be reckoned with. But don't discount South Africa and Brazil. South Africa has a military of just over 71,000 active personnel and nearly 30,000 reserves. As for Brazil, which presents the most immediate on-land threat to the US, it has an army of 360,000 active personnel and around 1.3 million reserves. That gives BRICS 5.2 million active military personnel, with around 4.8 million reserves. Assuming all reserves are called into action on both sides, that stacks America's 2.1 million reserve and present military personnel against an overwhelming BRICS force of over 10 million. It's not looking good for the United States on the manpower front. However, BRICS faces the problem of actually getting its people to the US. Russia attempts to filter in troops via the Bering Strait, which separates Russia from the United States by just 53 miles at its narrowest point. But those efforts are slow going and constantly impeded by a powerful US Navy. Even the Russians who make it past the strait have to navigate Alaska and a part of Canada to get into the northern US. There is a more direct threat to America's south. Brazil is the only BRICS nation that has a direct land connection to the United States, albeit one that runs through Mexico, and it's possible that BRICS could get Mexico on its side if it invades the US. After all, the US administration proposed 25% tariffs on Mexico, and an executive order to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America have already created a contentious relationship. Should Mexico say yes to Brazilian troops streaming through its country into the US, that would force America to face an active Brazilian force of 360,000 on land. But that assumes Mexico is on board with the plan. If it doesn't, Brazil would be forced to invade via the Gulf of America and the Gulf of California, neither of which are attractive options. It would be forced to navigate through America's Navy, which is a major hurdle, as we'll soon explain. Plus, if Brazilian troops land in Texas, they'll face over 108,000 active soldiers stationed there. Landing in California is even worse. There are more than 156,000 active service members located in the state. Combine the two, and you get around 264,000 American troops. That's not quite enough to match Brazil's incoming force. But the US can use its Navy to bottleneck the arrival of Brazil's troops to gain an advantage. Throw the 43,000 troops stationed in Hawaii into the mix, and the US can almost match Brazil on the manpower front. As for the other BRICS nations, they face problems of their own. China is separated from the US via the Pacific Ocean. South Africa is in a similar situation, only it needs to navigate the Atlantic. As for India, its position in the middle of China and South Africa means that it could divide its forces to attack via either ocean, though it still faces the same problems of getting into the US in the first place. So BRICS has a clear manpower advantage, however it faces a ton of problems in utilizing that manpower in its US invasion. And it gets worse for BRICS on that front. Do you remember that we mentioned that the US has 750 military bases in 80 countries? While that reduces US manpower domestically, it also gives America options for attacks closer to BRICS nations. For instance, America has 73 bases in South Korea, 7 in Australia, and 120 in Japan. With the bases combining to contain over 81,000 troops, that is a strong fighting force that could hold up China and India as they try to attack from the Pacific. At worst for the US, it would still force those two BRICS nations to divert their attention away from the American mainland for a while. The same applies to Russia. America has 25 UK bases, 119 in Germany, 44 in Italy, and 4 in Spain. That allows it to create a European front designed to prevent Russia from easily making it to the US via the Atlantic Ocean. Using these bases as diversions would allow the US to focus most of its domestic manpower on Brazil's soldiers, at least during the early stages of the war against BRICS. And that brings us to the naval battle. A majority of the confrontation between BRICS and the US will take place in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, with skirmishes in the waters close to Russia and China likely taking place if the US breaks through and attacks. The Indian Ocean might also become a battleground, but that would depend on America's ability to get through the Pacific and bypass China. America is in a very good position on the naval front. While it doesn't have the world's largest navy in terms of pure assets, with its 440 vessels putting it in second place, it easily comes out on top in the tonnage front. America's ships combined to displace over 4,500,000 tons of water. Why does that matter? Water displacement indicates the size and power of the ships in a country's navy. It shows us that the US has larger ships, which means it can pack more firepower and better defenses into its vessels. Among those ships are 11 aircraft carriers and 9 helicopter carriers, which will prove vital to the aerial aspect of the war we'll discuss later. The US also maintains 81 destroyers, which are massive warships capable of blowing holes in other vessels, along with 26 corvettes. It also has 70 submarines, which America could use to attack BRICS surface vessels and, if need be, launch nuclear warheads at the BRICS nations. Of course, the combined BRICS nations aren't slouches on the naval warfare front. China's Navy has 754 assets, which is over 300 more than the US brings to the fight. However, the tonnage issues come into play here. China's Navy collectively displaces around 3.1 million tons, which translates to it having much smaller vessels than the US. China brings 3 aircraft carriers and 4 helicopter carriers to the fight, along with 50 destroyers, 47 frigates, and 72 corvettes. It also has a solid stock of 61 submarines. However, a fifth of its navy is made up of patrol vessels. Those might be fine for serving as an early warning system on the Chinese coast, but they are not going to do much to stop America's destroyers. Russia also has a large navy containing 419 assets. However, the Russian Navy has an even smaller tonnage than China's, displacing almost 1.4 million tons. Combine that with China, and you get 4.5 million tons, just enough to match the US Navy. Another 63 submarines, 10 destroyers, and an aircraft carrier are added to the BRICS forces thanks to Russia. Of course, we can't forget about the other 3 BRICS nations. India's Navy is the 6th largest in the world at 293 assets, and it displaces over 650,000 tons of water. India adds another 2 aircraft carriers and 13 destroyers into the mix. It also has 18 submarines, 18 corvettes, and 14 frigates. Brazil and South Africa haven't invested as heavily into their navies as their BRICS compatriots. South Africa brings just 49 vessels to the fight, most of which are patrol ships. However, it does add 3 submarines and 4 frigates to the BRICS numbers. As for Brazil, it only has 64 assets, about a third of which are patrol ships. It adds another 4 submarines along with a helicopter carrier and 6 frigates. Still, it adds up. Combining the naval forces of the BRICS nations leads to the 5 bringing more submarines and smaller warships to the fight. The US still has the advantage on the destroyer front, along with having more aircraft carriers, but the fight would be close. BRICS has the numbers advantage. As Captain Sam J. Tangretti, who's a retired member of the US Navy, points out, research on 28 historical naval wars shows us that 25 of them were won by the side with the larger fleet. It was only when fleet size was roughly equal that the superior technology won the day. The US is at a numbers disadvantage on the naval front, and that is a bad thing for its chances. Still, the numbers disadvantage isn't so massive that the US can't put up an extremely strong fight in the Pacific, Atlantic, and all the smaller seas surrounding the BRICS nations. Several of its fleets also already operate overseas. For instance, the 7th Fleet, which is the largest of the US Navy's front-deployed fleets, operates up to 70 ships and 150 aircraft at any one time. It operates in the area stretching from the international dateline to the border between India and Pakistan. This area covers the Pacific and Indian Oceans to allow the fleet to put up an immediate defense against China and India. And that's how the US would use its navy: defense. Its goal would be to hold back the combined BRICS navies for as long as possible. Its problem would be that it has to divide its forces on 2 fronts. Half the US Navy would fight in the Atlantic, the other half in the Pacific, allowing the BRICS numbers advantage to pay off as the war approaches its midpoint. Or it would, but the US has a trump card up its sleeve: the US Air Force. Not only is the US Air Force powerful in its own right, as we'll soon show, but it regularly works alongside the US Navy to conduct joint operations. That's why the US has so many aircraft carriers. It'll be bringing plenty of aircraft to a naval fight. Of course, the BRICS nations have that option too, thanks to their aircraft carriers that China and India maintain. However, they may run into cooperation issues, with their lack of direct combat experience making it difficult to make full use of their naval-based aerial forces. The US could take advantage of those problems by using its aircraft carriers to decimate BRICS vessels via its fighters and helicopters. That brings us to the aerial forces each combatant brings to the war. The US, as is the case in so many other areas of warfare, is easily the strongest nation when it comes to aerial might. The US military has over 13,000 aircraft, which is the most out of any nation in the world. It also comes out on top in the fighters category, with close to 1,800 and 900 attack-type aircraft. America is the world leader in every major category of aircraft. It has 918 fixed-wing transports, over 2,600 trainers, 647 special mission craft, and nearly 7,000 helicopters and attack choppers. But the potential difference maker in the US arsenal is its fleet of aerial tankers. These aircraft will prove just as vital to the naval aspect of the battle as the aerial side of it. A tanker is an aircraft that provides aerial refueling capabilities to other aircraft. In practice, that means the US can keep its fighters and attack-type craft in the air longer than the BRICS nations, allowing them to cause more damage. The jewel in the American tanker fleet is the KC-135 Stratotanker, capable of reaching speeds of up to 530 miles per hour while flying at 30,000 feet. The tanker has a 1,500-mile range while carrying 150,000 pounds of fuel. For context, America's F-35A planes have an internal fuel capacity of almost 18,500 pounds. That means a single KC-135 can refuel an F-35A 8 times before the tanker has to be grounded. America would take advantage of its global military presence to send its tankers into the skies. Tankers could take off from Japan to circle the seas surrounding China. Those tankers would stay out of range of the enemy's aerial defenses and likely have American fighters and drones defending them from BRICS aerial assaults. For as long as those tankers stay in the skies, they serve as refueling points for America's other aircraft. The US could send F-35s from one of its aircraft carriers to bombard China's ships with missiles. Tankers also make long-distance assaults possible. If the US wants to attack key military targets in any of the BRICS nations, its tankers essentially extend the range of its bombers and fighter jets so they can reach countries that are thousands of miles away. Of course, the BRICS nations combine to present an air force that represents a sturdy challenge to the US. China has a fleet of 3,300 aircraft, which includes 371 attack types and 1,200 fighter jets. However, it only has 10 tankers. Similarly, Russia has a large air force of 4,300 aircraft, which includes 833 fighters and 689 attack types. However, it also has only 19 tankers, and almost half of its air assets are helicopters that won't be of much use unless the BRICS nations manage to reach American soil. India adds another 2,200 aircraft to the BRICS Air Force, with 513 of them being fighters, along with 130 attack types. But again, close to half of India's air force is choppers, and it only has 6 tankers. South Africa is almost a non-factor. 97 of its 182 aircraft are helicopters, with another 81 of its crafts being trainers. Bringing 2 fighters and 12 fixed transports won't contribute much to the BRICS aerial assault. Brazil fares a little better with 513 aerial assets, including 43 fighters and 38 attack types. It could also attempt to use its 109 fixed-wing transports to fly troops into the US. However, it also brings no tankers to the fight. That tanker usage is the potential difference maker for the United States. BRICS only has 35 tankers, compared to more than 600 available to the US Air Force. Perhaps that disparity opens up some strategic opportunities for the US on the naval and aerial fronts. America could use its submarines to attack the BRICS aircraft carriers, limiting BRICS' ability to attack American ships with fighters and bombers. It could also take advantage of the range disadvantage created by BRICS having access to so few tankers. Taking even some of those 35 refueling planes out of the sky limits the range of the BRICS aerial forces to the seas surrounding their countries. That would mean a very limited number of BRICS aircraft making it to the US. On the naval front, the US could deploy its aircraft carriers, each with a flotilla of destroyers, to the seas around the BRICS nations. The US would likely deploy multiple carrier strike groups to key strategic locations, a couple in the North Atlantic, the Western Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, with additional carriers in the Atlantic to counter Brazil and South Africa. Each of those carriers would be positioned beyond the reach of BRICS nations' fighters, attack aircraft, and anti-ship ballistic missiles, which have a striking range of up to 2,500 miles. Those carriers enable aerial bombardments of BRICS vessels, with American tanker fleets ensuring that the country's aircraft can stay in the skies for longer. The US would also have to blockade entry into Brazil to prevent the rest of the BRICS nations from transporting troops into that country that could then move north and attack the US from the south. Same goes for the Bering Strait. The US can't afford to allow Russia access to the mainland via that narrow water passage. Still, it might be able to manage it by combining its naval and aerial assets. That's the power of America's combined approach to warfare. It's not just bringing its ships to a naval fight, it's also bringing powerful aircraft. And when you supplement all of this with the global military bases we mentioned earlier, the US gives itself plenty of options for attack while still being able to defend some of its most valuable naval assets. It would also force the BRICS nations to use their air forces to guard their own territory, rather than attack the American mainland. For some of those nations, notably Brazil and South Africa, that could be a warfare death sentence as they're hit constantly with American missiles and bombs until they're forced to pull out of the fight. Let's say that BRICS manages to break through the combined naval and aerial blockade. It finds a route into the US mainland via the Atlantic or Pacific, with the countries working together to transport troops via that route to bring a ground war to the US. We already know BRICS comes out on top in terms of pure manpower, though even with this naval route opened, it would still face a challenge of getting that manpower onto the American mainland. But what about the ground equipment front? The US is no slouch in that department. It maintains a stockpile of 4,600 tanks, which is the third most in the world. However, it's on the military vehicle front that America truly excels. It has 392,000 vehicles, which include everything from armored fighting vehicles to personnel carriers, that it could deploy into its territory at will. That gives the US a major logistical advantage if the war with BRICS arrives on the American mainland. The US falls a little behind on the artillery front, with 671 self-propelled units and 1,200 towed artillery units. But again, it's BRICS that is invading the US, and that means the BRICS nations also have to find ways to transport their artillery into the US. The US also has 641 multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS, to bring to the fight. Combine all of that ground equipment with the US Air Force assets that aren't taking part in the naval battle, a standing army of around 1 million, and the potential for mobilization of an already well-armed American population, and BRICS faces a difficult nut to crack. But it's not an impossible fight. China's land forces include 6,800 tanks and 144,000 military vehicles. It also brings 4,500 self-propelled and towed artillery to the battle, along with almost 2,800 MLRS. Russia posts similar numbers. It has close to 5,800 tanks. Russia's also lost over 21,000 armored fighting vehicles in the fight with Ukraine, though it still has 132,000 left over. Add over 13,500 artillery units and around 3,000 MLRS to those numbers, and there's a clear advantage forming for BRICS in every aspect of the land power front other than military vehicles. India extends that advantage so it covers vehicles, as it adds another 149,000 to the mix, along with around 4,200 tanks. Its nearly 4,000 units of towed artillery could also be useful. South Africa and Brazil bring up the rear again, though they still contribute. South Africa has 18,700 military vehicles and 252 tanks to add to the BRICS numbers, though it is limited to less than 300 units on the artillery and MLRS fronts. Brazil posts similar, though slightly higher numbers. It has 22,500 vehicles, 294 tanks, 412 units of towed artillery, 109 units of self-propelled artillery, and 38 MLRS systems. They're far from groundbreaking numbers, but Brazil's proximity to the US could make them useful if Mexico allows Brazil to pass through. But therein lies the problem on the land front: proximity. The BRICS nations have to find ways to ship all of this equipment into the United States. Even if BRICS manages to secure a naval passage into the US, it'll have done so at a massive cost. Hundreds of ships will be sunk, along with hundreds of aircraft being shot out of the skies. And even with that passage established, BRICS can't send everything into the US at once. It would have to send its land equipment in drips and drabs, forcing long pauses to the war as BRICS replenishes stockpiles in areas of the US it captured. That would give the US time to manufacture more weapons, which brings us to the next issue in the BRICS versus US war. The US spends more on its military than any other nation in the world. Its proposed budget for the 2025 financial year is $850 billion, with that annual budget likely to rise to $866 billion adjusted for inflation by 2029. The US also has an interesting advantage in that most of its military equipment is designed and produced domestically. The likes of Lockheed Martin, RTX Corporation, Boeing, and General Dynamics are massive contributors to the US defense industry. Even corporations like BAE Systems, which is based in the UK, have US production lines that could keep running during the battle against BRICS. America's tactics would be simple: keep pumping all of that money into weapons production while ensuring its manufacturing facilities are well defended against the incoming BRICS military. That's another advantage that the extended naval and aerial battles bring to the US. Taking out as many BRICS ships and aircrafts as possible limits BRICS' ability to launch missiles and similar aerial strikes against America's weapons production. Of course, the BRICS nations have a large military budget as well. Again, the heavy hitters are China and Russia. China announced a 7.2% increase in its military budget in 2024, bringing its spending to $236.1 billion per year. In 2024, Russia's military budget was $129 billion. India has also announced a massive budget increase for the 2025 financial year. It will up its spending by 9.5% to $78.4 billion. Brazil adds another $23.7 billion into the mix, though most of its budget goes toward maintaining its military personnel rather than building its equipment stocks. Then there's South Africa, and while the other BRICS nations are spending as heavily as they can, South Africa goes in the opposite direction. Its 2024 to 2025 defense budget was just a tiny 0.7% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. Given that its GDP was $380.7 billion in 2023, some quick math tells us that the country spent about $2.66 billion on defense in 2024. That is well below even the $3 billion it spent in 2022, which was also an 11.74% decline on the previous year. In essence, South Africa is almost a non-contributor on the budget front. Combine the 5 BRICS nations and you get a total budget of almost $470 billion, just over half of what the US spends on defense. That could be a massive difference maker as the naval war of attrition takes hold. As the BRICS nations suffer losses in aircraft, ships, and personnel, they'll face a critical challenge: replenishing their stockpiles. The US military, with its vast budget and domestic manufacturing capacity, can replace losses far more efficiently than its adversaries. While Russia and China are major weapons producers, they'll be crippled by disrupted trade routes due to relentless naval battles. The two could trade resources, with Russia's iron ore and China's rare earth minerals supporting their war industries, but without matching America's defense spending, they'll struggle to sustain their war effort. Or they would, if it weren't for one factor. BRICS and the US don't spend their money in the same way. As the Center for Economic Policy Research, or CEPR, points out, the flat budgets we've already mentioned only indicate what BRICS nations would procure if they spent their money in the United States. They don't do that. A more accurate measure comes from purchasing power parity, or PPP. According to CEPR, PPP factors in local manufacturing and troop costs, which are lower among the BRICS nations than they are in the US. Using this metric, China spends the equivalent of $541 billion on its military in 2024, more than double the dollar amount assuming the country spent the money in the US. What it all comes down to is that production is cheaper for BRICS nations than it is for the US. Though America spends more in terms of pure dollar amounts, adjusting for PPP may just put BRICS ahead, especially if all 5 nations funnel their money into China to take advantage of the lower costs. There's one final factor to consider in the war between the US and BRICS: nuclear weapons, and both sides have a lot of them. The US brings 5,200 nuclear weapons to the table. That's enough to destroy all the BRICS nations. However, BRICS can hit right back on the nuclear front. Russia has 5,600 nukes. China has around 600. India even contributes with 172 nuclear weapons. If the war got to the point where each side was willing to push the big red button, there would only be one outcome: mutual destruction. Assuming it doesn't get to that point, the outcome of the war between the US and BRICS would hinge on a naval battle. BRICS brings more ships to the front. However, the US has bigger and more powerful ships, along with integration with its air force that could help it cause havoc on the BRICS Navy. If the BRICS forces were magically transported to the US all at once, they would grind out a victory on American soil. But that's not what would happen. With a smart naval and aerial strategy, the US might just be able to stop BRICS from ever mounting a serious land assault on American soil. Given how devastating the war would be to both sides, that's about as close to a victory as either is going to get. Who do you think would come out on top in a full-scale war between the US and BRICS? Would America's military dominance and industrial power be enough, or could BRICS leverage its massive manpower and resources to change the global order? Drop your thoughts below. Now go check out US plan if China takes Taiwan, or click on this video instead.